Well, the first part of my paper will be mostly historical and expository, and then the second part I will relate before going to a more contemporary phenomenon, namely of prefigurative politics. I want to preface my paper with that remark. So the title is Beginning Anew, Hannah Arendt on Freedom and Revolution. So one of Hannah Arendt's essays, written in approximately 1967, has remained unpublished for over half a century. This untitled essay draws a distinction between liberty and freedom in order to better understand what kind of freedom is at stake in revolutions in the modern era. While her text contains various ideas that already appeared in her prior publications, it is particularly intriguing to discern the ways in which Arendt mobilizes some of these concepts to elucidate various revolutionary events in her own time, such as post-war decolonization, the Vietnam War, and the Cuban Revolution. In this paper, I will explore how, according to Arendt, the problem of freedom arises in the Western tradition and how she understands political freedom by analyzing her essay, What is Freedom? I will then investigate the meaning of Arendt's expression, the freedom to be, in her until recently unpublished essay, The Freedom to Be, the Meaning and Function Revolution. It was an untitled essay, but the editors have given this title to the essay. Freedom is, in her view, not simply an exercise of the will, but rather the capacity to publicly act in ways that are new, surprising, and unpredictable. I will relate that notion to the concept of prefigurative politics, my final part. And there I will draw out several implications of Arendt's reflections upon freedom as embodied practice for understanding the action-based dimension of contemporary prefigurative politics as a means toward a more radically free and democratic society in our own time. So we start with the great divorce, separating freedom from politics. In her essay, What is Freedom?, Arendt first lays out the paradoxical nature of the concept of freedom. On the one hand, our conscience tells us that we are free and therefore morally responsible for our actions. Yet on the other, we are also conscious of the fact that all of our actions in the outer world are subject to causality, which would seem to negate this very freedom. Although Kant tried to redeem freedom by distinguishing between theoretical understanding, or pure reason, and the will, practical reason, Arendt notes that this solution does not eventually work because the phenomenon, as she says, quote, the phenomenon of freedom does not appear in the realm of thought at all, unquote. Rather than freedom appearing in the domain of ideas, Arendt argues that in ancient Greece, it initially found its true expression in political action, in speech and deed in the public realm. However, this concept of freedom as embodied action soon became separated from the political sphere. In the ancient Greek world, freedom was originally manifested in the political realm by persons deliberating and acting in the public sphere for the common good of the city, of the polis. As such, freedom was a fact of everyday life, and it was not considered as a philosophical problem or an object of inquiry. And it was not considered as such from the pre-Socratics until Plotinus, quite a significant period. However, the expansion of the Roman Empire resulted in the decline of political freedom, which generated an increasingly pervasive sense of powerlessness, leading to the emergence of the philosophy of freedom. Kai Heruta notes in this regard that, quote, just as adults reflect on childhood when they are no longer able to enjoy it innocently, ancients came to reflect on freedom when they were no longer able to enjoy it immediately, unquote. It is thus very telling that the first philosopher to develop a robust philosophy of freedom was Epictetus, and he was born under conditions of slavery during the time of Emperor Nero. Epictetus developed an understanding of freedom as self-possession or self-control, self-governance, as the capacity to control one's own wishes and desires. So his definition of a free person is, quote, he who lives as he wishes. And this is strangely reminiscent of a sentence in Aristotle's Politics, actually. And here Aristotle puts the statement, freedom means doing what a man likes, the childish version that Abigail spoke about, in the mouths of characters who have no idea of what freedom entails. But in a peculiar reversal, Epictetus ironically reiterated this same concept various centuries later as a proper definition of freedom. So this is what freedom is like, according to him. So we have a strange reversal here. By restricting yourself to what is within your control, he argued, then you can prevent yourself from entering a domain where you might be impeded. And if your inner desires are frustrated, if you do reach beyond that, you should transform your desires rather than your external conditions. And this is a sort of a thinking that would fit the person who is under conditions of slavery. For Epictetus, the art of living is thus about being free from one's own desires, being able to distinguish between, quote, the alien world over which man has no power and the self of which he may dispose as he sees fit. Epictetus began to see withdrawal from the worldly realm of politics as a condition for the most free and virtuous way of life. And we know this as the vita contemplativa. And he did so by reconceptualizing freedom from public action to inner feeling, realm of inwardness, an interior domain in which one may escape to feel free. Arendt aptly characterizes Epictetus's depoliticized conception of freedom as, quote, a formulation through which one may be a slave in the world and still be free, unquote. And if you look at a footnote there, this concept has a quite long and deeply troubling afterlife, because during the history of the slave trade, there were also Christian missionaries baptized people without it leading them to being set free. So they were set free from their sins, but not from their chains. It's not an innocent idea. While Epictetus thought that humans are sovereign rulers within their own self, it was, notes Arendt, the Apostle Paul and later St. Augustine who discovered the idea of a divided self. So whereas ancient philosophers acknowledged the strife between soul and body, or opposing desires, between two different faculties like reason or emotion, the Apostle Paul introduced the idea of a will that is at war within itself. In Romans, we all know this text, in Romans 7:19, Paul writes, For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. For Paul, our human nature is such that the moment we will to do right, we always find within ourselves the will to do wrong. Arendt observes in this regard how the murderous dialectics, her phrase, of this perpetual warfare within revealed first to Paul and then to Augustine the equivocalities and impotence of the human heart. That's also her phrase. This Pauline concept of a will which is broken in itself, which wills and wills not at the same time, has become a decisive factor in the history of Western notions of freedom, from the Stoic idea of freedom as self-control to the modern view of freedom as sovereignty. And the shared characteristic of these later notions of freedom is that they conceive of freedom more as a phenomenon of the will or a thought, rather than of doing and acting. And these will-based notions of freedom stand in contrast to the ancient idea of freedom as embodied in action. This can be illustrated well by Machiavelli's concept of virtù. Virtù refers to the qualities that enable a person to act decisively in the world and to seize the opportunities that the world opens up in all its unpredictability. So the rich meaning of virtù is well encapsulated in the attribute of virtuosity. This is a quality that we ascribe to people who are doing performative arts, musicians and dancers, for example. So whereas the creative arts result in an end product that has an independent existence and also outlives the activity which it brought about, the performing arts are arts in which the achievement resides in the act of the performance itself. So unlike the work of art, which has an independent existence, as I said, as a product of creative effort, Arendt argues that the state is dependent upon continual action, that it is therefore preserved by the same means that brought it into being in the first place. For Arendt, politics has a close connection to the performing arts in that they both need, quote, a publicly organized space for their activity, and both depend upon others for the performance itself. So given that after Epictetus and Paul, freedom was experienced as something occurring in the interplay between me and myself rather than the dynamics between me and others, freedom and free will became synonymous notions, especially in the modern era. So in her description of the resurgence of political theory during the emergence of the modern age, she distinguishes between two types of political thinkers. So on the one hand, there were the founders of political science, who were, as the word says, animated by the new findings of natural sciences, people such as Hobbes. On the other hand, there were those like Montesquieu who returned to the political thought of ancient Greece and Rome, because the separation of church and state had led to an independent secular political realm that had been unknown since the fall of Rome. So what the notions of freedom in both of these modern traditions have in common is that they constitute a misapplication, according to Arendt, of the concept of freedom as free will to the political realm. So they use the concept of will, put it into the worldly realm. By applying this notion of freedom as free will to the political sphere, there is a philosophical transition from action to willpower. As a result of the shift, the ideal of freedom transitioned from virtuosity, acting in concert with other people in shared space, to sovereignty. And this means led to an emphasis on the concept of a free will, autonomous from others, and also dominant over them. So again, this has deleterious effects in the history of political theory. The political danger of this shift, according to Arendt, is clearly visible in Rousseau's theory of sovereignty. So his conception of political power is derived from the model of individual willpower. His concept of sovereign freedom creates a dilemma. Either it results in the denial of human freedom, when you realize that whatever persons may be, we are not really sovereign. We're not really sovereign, but we might be inclined to deny that we actually have freedom. So this is the first horn of the dilemma. Or it leads to the idea that the freedom of one group of person can be secured only at the cost of the freedom of others, and the sovereignty of other respective groups. It becomes a warlike game. This dilemma highlights two features of the theory of freedom as sovereignty. First, this freedom is framed in terms of control. So you're free insofar as you are able to subject everything within your own will, so on a personal level. And second, this freedom is based upon an analogy between a free person and a free state. Like a free person who exercises control over himself, a free state exercises control over its territory. Just as being a free person requires freedom from interference, so a free state also requires freedom from interference by other states, and also mastery over internal divisions, like you also master your own desires as a person. And Arendt thus concludes, quote, where men wish to be sovereign as individuals or as organized groups, they must submit to the oppression of the will, be this the individual will, with which I force myself, or the general will of an organized group. Then she closes here, if men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce, unquote. So after this philosophical genealogy of the problem of freedom, Arendt returns one final time to the politics of Greek antiquity to further clarify her account of political freedom, which she understands as, quote, the freedom to call something into being which did not exist before. This also relates to our concept of natality, new beginnings. In this context, she notes that the Greek verb archein means to begin, to lead, and also to rule, which are reflective of an experience in which being free was seen as the equivalent of having the capacity to begin something new. Arendt observes in this regard that it is in the very nature of every new beginning that it miraculously breaks into a world as an infinite probability, which actually speaks about political action as having a miraculous character, to interrupt the autonomous process of history by bringing something new into the world. And she elaborates upon this theme of freedom as new beginning in her until recently unpublished essay about what kind of freedom is at stake in revolution. And this is the essay about the revolution, also in her own time. So in her essay, The Freedom to be Free, Hannah Arendt reflects upon the nature of revolution and freedom, prompted by the global decolonial revolutions in the immediate post-war World War II era. Arendt first traces the etymological meaning of the term revolution, noting that it originally referred to the eternally revolving motions of astronomical bodies. It was near the end of the 17th century, she suggests, that the word was applied metaphorically in a historical political context to the restoration of a preordained order with the aim to restore freedom. Yet it was only in the late 18th century that the word revolution gained the meaning that it has today. So while the revolutionaries during this period also sought to restore an ancient so-called natural order of things, they eventually recognized that they had undertaken an entirely new project, and despite their own reluctance, had started an irreversible process. Ironically, their efforts to restore and reclaim old rights and privileges, they wanted to conserve and restore such rights in the late 18th century, and it led to the exact opposite outcome, which Arendt describes as, quote, a progressive development and the opening up of a future which defied all further attempts at acting or thinking in terms of circular or revolving motion. Unquote. While the meaning of the word revolution does underwent a radical transformation during these revolutionary events, a similar yet significantly more complex development occurred with the term freedom. Skip a part of it. In order to elucidate the meaning of this new development, Arendt draws a conceptual distinction between liberation and freedom. So whereas the concept of liberation is essentially negative, that it's in the sense that it refers to freedom from unjustified restraint or oppression, the concept of freedom is positive and pertains to the freedom to participate in public affairs. So while liberties understood as civil rights are the result of liberation, they are, according to Arendt, certainly not to be equated with the substance of freedom. If the revolutions merely attempted to secure civil rights, then the liberation from oppressive regimes would have sufficed. Although the revolutionaries initially only wanted to restore freedom, they quickly passed beyond the implied limits of such restorative aims. Whereas on the one hand, liberation, the aspiration to be free from oppression, can potentially be realized under monarchical rule, though not under tyrannical governance. Freedom, on the other hand, requires the establishment of a new, or more accurately, a rediscovered form of document, a republic. So she concludes, it was a passion for this new political freedom, though not yet equated with a republican form of government, which inspired and prepared those to enact a revolution without fully knowing what they were doing. So, and then she goes into the social question. So there was a transition to a new form of government, but the social conditions were not really transformed yet. People were still living in abject poverty. That was later taken up also by the later revolutions. But I'll go to the end here. Yeah, and now she says here, if violence pitted against violence leads to war, violence pitted against social conditions has always led to terror. And one of the alternatives to such violent terror is the politics of prefiguration, which is based in practices that strive towards revolutionary change, not by forcing a sort of an ideal of equality, but by acting with greater unity between means and ends. This last section. In recent years, social mobilizations such as the Occupy movement, the Zapatistas in Latin America, and the Indignados have sparked a renewed interest in the concept of prefigurative politics. And this concept challenges the dominant state-centric approach in social movement and social change literature, which views existing political institutions as both the primary target of mobilization and the principal means of achieving political transformation. Prefigurative politics, by contrast, seeks to model or prefigure, the term comes from biblical hermeneutics, by the way, a future society on a micro level, aiming to realize radical social change through practices in the here and now. We are building the future in the now, as a deeply eschatological aspect too. In this way, activists express their future political goals through their current methods, creating experimental or alternative social environments within the existing society. So if you want to create a society without violence, then you should not use violent methods in order to secure such a society. So that's the means ends unity of prefigurative politics. So for Arendt, freedom of action springs from principles that become only fully manifest in the performing acts themselves, as we saw. And that's the comparison to virtuosity. The embodiment of principles comes only through action. They are visible in the world as long as the action lasts. Freedom appears in the world whenever such principles are actualized. The appearance of freedom, like the manifestation of principles, coincides with the performing act. For Arendt, freedom is an inherently political phenomenon that requires public action and interaction within a shared political space. Her focus on freedom as public action and collective agency resonates with prefigurative politics as a revolutionary practice. Insofar as Arendt understands freedom as experienced in the process of acting and nothing else, prefigurative politics, which seeks to actualize a more democratic and free future society in the here and now through direct action, can be understood in Arendtian perspective as a practice of freedom. Prefiguration can rightly be said to be animated by precisely such, quote, a freedom which is not an attribute of the will, but an accessory of doing and acting. As such, it resonates with the meaning of revolution from an Arendtian optic as the actualization of one of the greatest and most elementary of our potentialities, the experience of being free to make a new beginning. So if freedom finds its true expression in political action, in speech and deed in the public realm, then prefiguration, as based in practice, can be seen as advancing novelty in the realm of free action, as continual beginnings without ends. Thank you.
About 10 minutes for a question time. 5 minutes? Or 9 minutes? Thank you, Daniel, for the description of Arendt's politics and new accent forum against a politic of the sovereign state and sovereign self. For instance, I critique both by Chakravarti Spivak and Julie Butler in the book Who Sings the End of the Nation State, where Butler argues that the end of the fall of the Westphalian state, not sovereignty as before, is a parallel to the fall also of the anthropological sovereignty. The individual is more in control of what he thought he was in control of. So I like these kinds of interpretation of the Arendt, performing understanding of politics. But my question goes with a parallel critique of Sheila Habib and Hannah Arendt when she asked, who is the agent? A Western agent, a global agent? So I agree with this dynamization of politics as performing, but still it remains unclear and can argue, probably because at her time the multicultural perspective was not still yet so much as it is now. So I'm asking the question, who is the performer, which group?
Arendt also, of course, acknowledges that in ancient Greece, the people who were actually free to be free were indeed the people, the Athenian men, especially the citizens, not the women or slaves and other more marginalized individuals. But I don't think she gives like immediate ideas about how we could expand the scope. But in this essay, I think she touches more upon the social question, because in another essay of her about Little Rock, that was a really controversial essay. She thought that, for example, discrimination was not an issue that should be sort of coercively acted against by the state. She thought this is a social issue, not a political issue proper. So I think that shows that she had maybe a blind spot, significant blind spot when it comes to that. But concerning prefigurative politics, what you see in prefigurative movements is that they enact egalitarian relationships. They try to banish hierarchy from their movements, and also to be inclusive in terms of the background in multiple agents. So I think Hannah Arendt does have some resources in terms of how she understands politics, but you really need other sources to really have a better sense of inclusivity, I think. It's difficult, I think, to find it in her work. Yeah.
So a question, how does Arendt's account function in situations in which political agency, political action is not really, it can really expressive due to conditions of oppression and inability to act in the political sphere. For instance, I'm thinking of someone like Dessertol, right, who has a way more darker conception of societal power, and therefore he emphasizes the importance of these everyday individual practices as means of resistance. So how would Hannah Arendt connect perhaps to Dessertol, and how would you speak to conditions in which public open action is
Point first, for how you need like public spaces in order to have this sense of democracy. So you need to build institutions or try to secure institutions that safeguard such public spaces. But in totalitarian conditions, it's very difficult, of course, to do that. I think her work does provide resources for trying to do it more on maybe on more local levels, like local democracy or like citizen councils. You might model maybe certain practices after that, even in totalitarian regimes. But yeah, she is a critic of liberal freedom, of the idea that true freedom resides out of politics. She's critical of that. So I think the local dimension would be the most important one there. And your first point about like practices of resistance on a more individual, personal level.
Everyday practices that Mr. Toll writes about.
Yeah.
Walking and.
Yeah, I think you could connect that to what Arendt says about natality, about trying to start anew. And it doesn't always have to be collective. It can also start, I think, personally. Every new life that comes into the world, has opportunities to act. So, if those individuals can find each other in a shared space, then then we can connect it also to the notion of plurality. And I think that's also important for democracy. So if it just stays individual, it does not for Adam has a really political character, of course. So you need to find spaces, even in such regimes, which you can connect with other people to form a collective, in a shared public space. That's, of course, very challenging.
Thank you for your paper. Bringing it home to us as the Society of Adventist Philosophers, how would you apply this to our denomination? And I'm thinking of the totalitarian sort of moves from the top down, and societies like this, and regions of Adventism like you come from, and Southern California. Is there room for a federated approach to governance in the Adventist Church? How does what you say apply to our situation?
Yeah, from the Netherlands, but not to comment on this controversial issue. But I just joking. That's an interesting one. I think in some ways our church governance structure is fairly democratic. We could quibble over that. But it's being used in ways that are not so democratic. So I think, of course, you can argue about the structures, but we need to cultivate a more democratic ethos. So democracy is not only about deliberating or about counting votes and all these things. It's also about a democratic spirit. So we could use Arendt's work to cultivate a more democratic spirit in our church. Creating more public spaces for discussion, and also where people with different views will be able to talk to each other. If this becomes a more normal situation, then there's also less of a need for people in higher positions of power to want to interfere. So I think it shows this situation shows the lack of truly shared spaces of discussion in our church.